And so it's definitely in there, like whether it's under tension or completely free of tension. I think we need to find a balance between those two, where we're okay, can we hold lengthened positions under tension? That's going to mold our fascial system to one way. And then also, can we let go of all that tension? Because that's ultimately like, the way our body from a Western lens views muscle contraction. It's yin and yang, it's on and off. It's and it may be isometric, it may not be concentric, eccentric, but it's is it stiff, is it relaxed? Is it stiff, is it relaxed? And can we make those more differentiated as opposed to being one muddled mess in between? That's kind of what makes us slow and injured.
That was Sam Wuest, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. If you're in the world of sports performance, you've probably heard of jump testing mats. These mats use hang time to measure total jump height or contact time to measure quickness abilities off of the ground. The best jump mat that I've come across also happens to be a sponsor of this show, which is the Plyomat. The Plyomat is not only accurate, easy to use, and affordable, but it also allows you to string multiple mats together to add an extra dynamic to plyometric testing and training. To check out the Plyomat, you can head to plyomat.net. That's plyomat.net. Today's podcast is sponsored by TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is an online software for coaches and trainers, and I've continued to hear great things about the TeamBuildr platform. If you're looking for either an in-house training portal for your training groups or an online training hub, be sure to check out the TeamBuildr training software. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. It's great to have you here, and I'm excited to welcome back to the show today guest Sam Wuest. He's an acupuncturist, a track and field jumps coach, a teacher of internal martial arts, and he also has a physical preparation, strength and conditioning background. And Sam combines that strength and conditioning or those physical preparation ideas with his training in traditional Chinese medicine. On the show today, Sam will be talking about concepts related to movement quality, elasticity, managing stress, and tissue quality, and how that goes into not just moving well, but also athletic longevity. When we see those athletes who are in their 30s or 40s or beyond, and they're still moving and competing really well, there's just something to that we don't talk about that much. We just will look at them and say, oh, wow, that athlete is really something special. But there's ways and there's things within that we can look at that can make, regardless of if we are training younger athletes or older, just an interesting and important lens by which to look at that total process. So I'm excited to get to the show today with Sam. I always enjoy our conversations and excited to get you guys this show. So let's get to episode 386 here with Sam Wuest. Sam, it's great to have you back on the show, man. And I know a lot has changed in terms of at least your location and where you're doing what you do. So tell me a little bit about your move down south, way south, and what brought you there and what you're up to now.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joel. Yeah, way south. I'm down here in Costa Rica. When my wife, who grew up in Costa Rica, found out we were pregnant, we decided to move closer to family. So we're down here. That's the primary impetus that got us down here. Obviously, if you've been to Costa Rica, you know that there's a whole lot to offer as far as health, wellness, and little did we know, even sport down here. We live in San Jose Central Valley, so we have access to, beautiful Olympic style stadium for track and field, basketball courts, everything. The gyms are amazing. And so what I'm doing right now basically is I'm still, treating, still an acupuncturist, I'm still a massage therapist. And we also have athletes that will come in and will train with us for, a number of weeks, or even in some cases, a month or two. And they'll come in to work on some specific objectives, usually track athletes working on, okay, I need to get my Excel pattern right. Okay, I need to come down and, we're going to train high jump. We're going to train, I've had some basketball guys come down and train just to dunk, basically. And it's been a great time because you get to come down, you get to remove yourself from, the outside, world, or you're in immediate environment if you're in the States or wherever you're coming from. And you get to, come here, train with less distractions, be in beautiful weather and beautiful nature. And, I work with them therapeutically as well. And that's a great little mix that we have going on. So that's really what I'm doing in person, as well as learning my online education programs and immersions.
Yeah, I had originally thought when I saw you in Costa Rica, I was thinking, well, acupuncture, Chinese medicine, kind of like the Eastern and Western. I thought you were like, I'm going to get away from the Western world and just chill, and I thought that was the main. I'm sure that's kind of like a nice piece of it all too. I mean, it seems to fit what you're doing really well.
Yeah, definitely. I think originally I kind of thought that that might be where I headed, but just because of the need of some athletes I'd worked with in the past, I ended up having, planning some of these training trips. And also just because, realistically, I'm, 2 meters tall in a country that doesn't have that many tall people. So playing pickup basketball here, you end up kind of pulled back into the sporting world. I can never really get away because it's what I like to do. So end up working with athletes in a variety of different, different languages, different aspects while I'm down here.
Yeah, the real reason is you just wanted to dominate pickup basketball. You're like, where can I go where I can just dunk on people? And
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Speaking of that, actually, you were just mentioning Jamal Crawford, and I know in line with what we'll be talking about with longevity today. Well, you said this in an email we actually shared prior to hopping on the call, was the most impressive track and field world record might be one that's almost not an actual open world record, but the Masters, the M40 high jump is absolutely mind blowing. Like, I thought it was just over 7 feet, but it's 7.5, and it was Topik, Dragoon Topik. He was 41, 7.5 at 41. That is just otherworldly.
He was a world junior record holder too.
Yeah.
So I don't know how they say the name. Is it Topic? Because it's Eastern European.
I probably screwed up. Yeah, sorry everybody in Eastern Europe.
Oh, yeah,
I'm sure
I apologize to you. I know 2 languages, not more than that. So yeah, that's amazing to have that sort of longevity where you're coming in as a junior athlete in one event in high jump, where you're doing the same thing. We know how much force goes into that ankle on takeoff. You can Google high jump pronation compilation and watch all these ankles, basically everting like crazy going into peak forces on takeoff. So that's an amazing feat. So yeah, let's talk about why,
Yeah. And all those I mean, there's a lot of them too. Every time somebody's doing something in their late 30s or early 40s like that, I mean, like Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price, as fast as she's running it, I think 36. A lot of people in the Caribbean too, and that's why I was kind of making the joke about Costa Rica, is it seems like Kim Collins from, I think it was St. Kitts. He had run 999 at 39, or maybe even 40. He was right there at 40. And there's something about that laid back, maybe that laid back island lifestyle that helps to prolong your ability to sustain outputs or something. But I'm sure, but it's not everyone. You get people like you were saying, like Jamal Crawford, who just from the States. It's I'd be curious what you think are some of the main factors. If I'm sure it's a lot, but what are some of the main factors that can lead to people who can sustain, not just endurance, because endurance can get better for a long time, but that to sustain the power output and to be able to sustain that ability.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there because it's something I've thought a lot about, both as I'm, in my 30s now, still continuing to train and perform, but also because a lot of the people that I work with on a regular basis are athletes. And unless I'm working specifically with a college sports team, I'm working usually with folks who have, gotten to that stage in their late 20s or, somewhere in their 30s or even early 40s where, hey, I'm running into injuries for the first time and I just don't know how to get out of this hole, or I'm just not able to, I feel like something's off with my hormones. I don't really know what it is, but I just don't feel quite the same. And so, okay, what are the people, let's reverse engineer. What are the people who are really doing it at, close to 40 at a peak level? What are they doing differently? I think some of the lessons that we can see, and again, I like Jamal Crawford as an example because I was listening to this interview the other day with, I think, By Any Means Basketball. And he was like, yeah, man, even when my daughter was born or my child was born, I was sneaking away to play hoops at LA Fitness, as opposed to just resting, as opposed to getting away from the game. And I think some of the people that you see last the longest, it's difficult for them to really get away from the activity fully, because a lot of times what happens is that people, when they step away, and they don't realize this, when you get older, you have an opportunity to step away from high performance in a way that you didn't when you were 20. Because all your friends are playing basketball on the weekends and you get pulled into it just by having friends or just by being social or just because you have so much energy at that age that you can't sit down for a long period of time. I know that if I didn't, exercise a certain way when I was 18 or 20, I'd be going nuts. So I had to self-regulate. If I didn't have a sport to do, I was running up a hill or, just bouncing off the walls, running to jump and touch something. it's natural at that age and it gets less. So I think not stepping away is a huge one. The other one that I think people, it's difficult is starting to integrate the changes that are happening to your body. So figuring out that, not the things that you did to make yourself super athletic are not necessarily the things you need to keep doing. And we can think about the metaphor that I usually like to use when I talk to people is, speed endurance, for example. You need to accelerate hard to if it's a 100-meter dash, let's use this example. You need to accelerate hard, if you're an Olympic sprinter, up to 60 meters. That's about when you hit top speed, right? And so, but what happens if you keep trying to accelerate harder after that time is your performance actually drops. You're not able to relax. You're not able to get into a rhythm and maintain the speed that you already have. And I think to some extent, the ideal athlete life cycle is you build when your body's really comfortable building, when it's all hands on deck. We need to learn coordination. We need to learn, how to, use our power outputs, our tendons and bones and everything like that needs to remodel. And they're already slightly, developing in a lot of, in a lot of the ages where we're expecting peak performance. They're still developing. Your body's still developing as a high school athlete. Your body's still developing as a college athlete in ways that we don't fully appreciate sometimes because we're not growing inches higher usually. But we're still developing. And because of that, we're a lot more, plastic, within our bodies and within our fascial matrix. So, I think understanding like, hey, the things that were working before may not be the things I need to dip into 100% as I get older. For example, I don't think for me, like I haven't, and the athletes that I work with still respond really well to them. So I still use them, especially, folks before the age of 30, but like heavy Olympic lifts, I just don't feel like I get enough out of them as opposed to how much they beat me up. And I still like Olympic lifting. I still like doing something light and it primes me for something else. And I feel like it's awesome. And if I exclude it for myself, I do think I miss it, but I just don't see the return being quite as high as it was in a different stage of life. And I think there's just the kind of things we need to consider as we start to get older is what is the return on investment of some of these things? And it may not be the same as how we got here.
Yeah, one of the things.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry to jump in. But one of the things that you had said that it just sparked something, and I had talked about Tony Holler with this, was just the joy in practice. And I think, in the context of track and field, a lot of times track is looked at as, oh, you're just going to go run like, 12 200s and it's going to, practice is going to be hard. And it's not like fast and joyful and all the things that are, more of that side of humanity. And I look at, you said Jamal Crawford, like you can't help but think too, like part of the reason he probably wanted to go play was just the love for the sport. Like the more love you have for what you do. And you even think too about like, how much joy a child has in playing and moving. And the more of that you can keep, the more, and it's obviously going to change as you grow, but I think there's still a piece of that the more you just have that just pure love to get out and play, I just think it must make it easier. I would imagine that probably had something to do with it, Oh
yeah, I think that's I'm really glad you brought up that childlike quality because I think that's really important in a couple ways, and they play into each other. Is both the physical and the mental of having that childlike state. On the mental side of it, it's in maintaining that enthusiasm, that excitement, where everything is fresh, everything is new. And on a physical level, you're not guarding as much. You're not overexerting yourself. There's a physical body language difference between doing a task when you are excited about it and you want to do it versus doing a task when it's a chore and it's work and I really don't want to. And I'm in pain and I don't feel good and yada, 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 yada. And maybe, you mentioned sunshine earlier too in different weather climates. And honestly, track is harder when you're in really freezing temperature. Yeah. It's not as much fun to be out at a track meet all day. I find that's certainly, I've high jumped since I've been down here. And, I can high jump fine. Like I, jumped in with one of my guys and I can clear, I'm not clearing like 2 meters yet, but I could next week if I train for it, like I'm in shape for it and I don't mind it. So like it's different when you are enjoying it both mentally and physically. And to further that on the physical side, we need to look at like, hey, how is our body changing as we get older? And, some of the things that we focus on in the West are really these quantitative measurements, these like, okay, numbers, yada, yada, yada. When in fact, I think, and this is really my background, like using my hands on people's bodies as part of my work, especially on athletes' bodies, is to understand that like the person who's perpetually injured, they have a different muscle tone or different adhesions in certain areas than somebody who doesn't. And so that's when like hands-on therapy, whether it's somebody else or like you get skilled at it for yourself, because these things are not equal. Like going to somebody who knows who they're doing and somebody who's, you know, your partner's massage could be really nice, but you know, might not be that skilled versus like you doing it and you just been mashing something on a foam roller for the past 10 years versus somebody who's like, oh, I took this deep dive and I actually took some bodywork courses and I, you know, took Sam's acupressure for athletes course and I integrate all these things into one, you know, into one cohesive package. That's my self-care package. And you actually find that people will restore some of these qualities of being softer and more supple, more able to turn tissue off as opposed to keeping everything on all the time, which is what a lot of our training tends to lead us towards.
Yeah, I find it interesting even, and not to get too far on a rabbit trail, but even in things like CrossFit, where the soft tissue work is usually referred to in kind of the same mentality as the activity, which is like smashing, you know, like go find the ball and smash it out or whatever, like that trigger point, go smash it. And it is interesting because you have a good therapist and it's anything but that. Not to say that there isn't some benefit from those types of things. I just also wonder, and I know that even just doing like the voodoo floss and all those bands, like, yeah, it made me feel better for sure. So I was just kind of wondering too, like based off what you're saying, like the longevity though, of if everything is just like, you know, more the hard aspect of the therapy.
Even the therapy, the tissue aspect, like research shows that compressing an area makes it more likely to get injured. So like if all of our therapy is compression based and pushing on something and mashing it, to use that sort of terminology, then in the short term, you can work out a knot like that, but to apply that to your entire, like an entire fascial chain makes no sense. Fascia responds best to like steady, slow, calm, gentle, and lifting, expansive movements. And so that's not something that you're going to give yourself by like using a barbell, like standing on your head, pointing your trap at the floor, like top of your shoulder. Like that's just not something that's going to happen very often. And even some of the environments people are doing this themselves in, if you're listening to metal, you know, doing some of your like self-therapy, like it's going to be a different vibe and a different effect than if you're kind of like calmed down in a somewhat darker room, you know, kind of controlling your setting as well.
Yeah, I remember in the warm-ups, this was towards the latter half of my years at Cal. With the swimmers, I remember there was a few days, I didn't do this all the time, but it was usually with smaller groups. So if you could see if the vibe was good and they liked it. But sometimes we would do like recovery days or easy days. I would actually put on classical music and get out like Indian clubs and stuff like that. And not everyone loved it, but some of the guys really liked it. Like I think they internally saw the shift that could happen with that. And I do think it's interesting because we are very good at compressing. Like I think especially in the West and training, and probably training really worldwide, you know, it's easy to compress things. But it takes a little bit more wisdom and time and then going through it. And I mean, I compressed myself for years into my early 30s, and then I've been trying to expand for the last 8 or so, and been working through that. But I think it is easy to compress. I think it takes a little more wisdom and time and just seeing how things go to expand. And then I do think the older you get to, just to kind of have that more of that mentality, like you said with the Olympic lifts. Like I still like Olympic lifting, but based off one of our last conversations, you mentioned the seasons and seasonality, and I've kind of saved my heaviest season is the winter. And it's like, you know, I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, so it's way different than your winter. Like I'll get outside and throw a sand bell around instead of doing this much sprinting, it's a lot more like throwing a sand bell over your shoulder. So it's like, you're still getting the posterior chain, but it's more like Rocky style. I'll do hill sprints and stuff and that type of thing and play. But then the summer, like it's the sunshine, it's track season, to be able to put the weights away. I mean, not completely, but a lot of them away for some time, and to attune your body to that, I think is helpful, because I think sometimes we get so attuned to compressing. Like that's the only thing we know. So just to be able to step outside of that for some time, I think, and I'm not even just saying for longevity, I think for everybody, no matter who you are, you know, I mean, unless it's like, my kids playing, so they don't even train, so it doesn't even matter. But like people who start to train, and I think it's very worthwhile to have time away from compression.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even we brought up different areas of the country, both weather-wise, but even in terms of culture. Like if you have other movement things that are in your repertoire, even if it's just dance, even if you just like have another like non-hard compressive whatever it is, like kind of like this aggressively yang, we talk about yin and yang, hard and soft, like this very hard yang aspect. If we don't have something to balance that, we tend to burn that up. And the excess of yang in Chinese medicine, like you see that wheel, the yin and yang moving in a circle. At the peak of yang turns into yin, just like the peak of summer turns into fall and starts to move in the opposite direction. And the peak of yang, and in our case, the peak of hardness is absolute rest. That's when you get hurt. That's when you can't go forward anymore. So if you don't balance that, your body will balance it for you. You will just have an injury and have to sit out. Like there's just no way around it, finding balance.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think learning to, learn, just that's the thing that definitely comes with wisdom. I think it is interesting too, because I think for even younger populations, like when athletes are introduced to training, we still get the same, you mentioned, the Dragutin Topic, I'm trying to say his name, but like he was a junior record holder and then eventually masters. And it is interesting the way that even kids are introduced to sport, especially training. It's like kids way too often get in the weight room lifting really heavy, like maxing out in middle school and testing. And it's like, well, where are you going to go from here? And I think, it's all that, it's the only thing that you are exposed to. And even too, I think, I don't think you have to get like too esoteric to balance that. Even doing like the Marinovich training system I found was very like expansive, where instead of, and I think a lot of pro athletes find their way to that kind of system, like Marinovich system or Sports Science Lab, like the balance discs, like the physio ball work, like, people hate on balance work, but it's kind of like the other thing. It's like it's more yin. And I always found like if I did a lot of heavy compressive stuff for a period of time, I found I really liked deloading with the Marinovich stuff, like a deload week, just piling in the Marinovich stuff. And that was really like my body felt really responsive after that. And just like everything felt connected and like you hit that little bit of expansion again. So it is interesting and plus too, like LeBron James, right? You see him, he's 38, 39 now, like playing at a high level, and you see him on little balance discs before the game. I know it's not his main training stimulus, but still, like, I don't know. I'd be curious what you think some of like the balance pieces and some of the yin or the longevity aspect of that and how it just fits with mainline training.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on some cool things right there. As far as the balance piece, it's a part of our nervous system. So like the ability to use proprioceptors, it really influences our ability to turn on and off, our ability to activate a lot of muscle tissue and produce force. If we don't sense ourselves comfortable, we won't produce force. And so we can't go all the way to, I'm just going to do everything I do on the backside of a Bosu ball, because then we're never going to find any force output. But we also can't ignore the fact that a lot of times, whether it's sport, where it's dynamic, or even a sport like track and field where the ground is flat, you usually don't have to do things, like unexpected shifts occur, and the body's ability to be more robust with our movement patterns is really important. I really think that, one other thing that I think is interesting is, you had Boo Schexnayder, I think was on your podcast talking about maybe you can link that because I'm going to butcher the paraphrasing, but talking about how, proprioception is a part of the nervous system. And I remember one thing that stood out for me from years ago, taking like week-long seminars from his coaching academy, was we are, by fatiguing certain things, on Monday, doing a certain amount of like heavy lifting, heavy bounding, accelerations, like very high central nervous system work. We come back from that Tuesday and do something technical, and we're dipping into a deeper pool of our proprioceptive abilities, because all of that, what balance does, what stabilize us on Monday, all that's shot. And like if you look at his training, he does a lot. He works hard and he rests hard. It's very black and white, very yin and yang. And so when he rests hard, he throws in some of this balance, but also even when you're still doing something difficult, somewhere in the middle where it's like technical, you're still putting out force, but it's not quite, heavy lifting. It's not quite everything's tensed all the time. Your body's ability to learn to use different proprioceptors, I think, is hugely influential to not only injury prevention, but also performance, and especially in the long term, especially when you have long seasons and you have to find these things under duress. The other thing I wanted, and if you have something, jump in, but the other thing I wanted to touch on too, when we talk about longevity in the Eastern European sort of system, is they have so many different drills for taking off. I remember my boss, who, Alex Ponomarenko, who was a coach for, Ukraine, coached Olympians over there. And he had this high jump manual from when he, did his doctorate in sports coaching, because that's how you coach at the Olympic level. And he's, in some of these countries in Eastern Europe, is you do a doctorate degree. So you have a lot of years of education. Looking at all the high jump drills, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I never had imagined all of these different ways to take off, to navigate space, to go over a bar. And looking back on it, I'm like, that was all, external motivation. So you're all looking at something, jumping over it, navigating space with your body, in addition to producing force outputs. I think sometimes in the West, we just focus on like doing one thing and producing a bunch of force in it. And we don't realize that, like, actually by finding a lot of things that are very similar to that one thing, or different ways to do that one thing, or different ways to make that one thing novel, because you have an athlete for, maybe 12 months in some of these systems. You don't have the college sports system. You don't have the high school season where you only have a kid for 4 weeks and then, okay, they got to go compete or else you lose your job. I don't know what people's thoughts are. People have varying ideas on how to navigate that. But, when you have somebody who's just like, yeah, it's just the neighborhood kids working out for a long time, you end up being a little bit more creative, because no one's going to come back if you don't.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it too, is I think it, in some ways, I my hope for this conversation, it's not, longevity is amazing. And I think people who, the audience listening, a lot of people, coaches who work with younger athletes, right? And so in one sense, it's like, okay, well, this is for me because I'm, aging as I train, and or people who are just, lifetime athletes in movement. But at the same time, this also does impact how we look at training for people who are in, high school or their athletic prime, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. And it's part of that is what you just said. It's, I really enjoy motor learning conversations. And there's the thought of, well, is there one perfect form that you just try to like keep, hammering away at, like trying to like put someone in this, oh, you didn't have your arm in this position, make it more over here. Your knee and your toe up wasn't enough on that, sprinter jump, do this, versus exposure to a lot of different movement patterns. And therein you have the novelty, you have robustness, because the human body gets more ways that it's stressed, but it's not stressed the same exact way over and over again. And there's just something to that. And I think it can fit for whether it's how you teach young athletes the game to begin with. And I do think there can be a little bit of fundamentals depending on what it is that are important. I wouldn't completely throw that out, but at the same time, like, unless there's some sort of exploration and the joy of that, that's where I see joy too. It's like there's joy in learning a skill in a way that isn't only like rote recitation and all that business. Like, I think that it can be really beneficial on both of those ends of the spectrum. And I just think that, yeah, from front to back, for how we experience, I would be curious too, in some perspective, if like the longevity of people who grew up like just super drill based, everything was like that, versus like soccer in the favela, like just roll out the ball and everyone goes out to play, and you just learn by the wisdom of the older kids, and they're teaching you. Like, I'd be curious, how that might factor into as well. It'd be really kind of interesting to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things you touched on there that I really want to go over before I get into that one.
Yeah.
One, I really think that, you're speaking to teaching people movement based on reflexes versus based on conscious cognitive control. Mm-hmm. And conscious cognition is never going to be as fast as a reflex. It just cannot be. That is, our reflexes bypass our conscious cognition for the most part. So actually, that's why a lot of cues, you tell a kid to do something and he doesn't do it. She can't. Mm-hmm. She can't bring her knees up. Her body tells her, from a nervous system level, that's happening at the nerve roots at her spine, is saying, I will not do that. I will not obey this command. It is bad for me. And coaches don't have the background to see that in a lot of cases. So that is what it is. But I think the best way to marry them is really, like, the way that I think about coaching now is to find a package of drills, general strength, things that an athlete needs to do to find, and specifically in track and field, to find like a decent foot shape, a good pelvic and spinal posture. And then from there, how do we layer reflexes onto those things? Because if those things are in the right position, we're in position to have good swinging segments, good swinging arms, good swinging legs. We're in position to have rotations. We're in position to have all these things. We don't need to overcoach them once they're in position. But if they're not there, we don't have the pelvis working functionally. We don't have a foot that can actually like grip the ground with the sole of the foot. The arches aren't engaged. Then it's going to be very difficult. You can train reflexively and they'll get a little better, but for the most part, they'll still have whatever gaping hole they have. So I think it's kind of, especially nowadays, because kids don't get enough physical activity and they don't get enough general strength. So you can't really just like throw a kid into a sport and expect them to have a background. They need more than they perhaps did 30, 40 years ago, based on the general health of the population, essentially.
Yeah, what you just said there, Sam, it was almost another way of saying, and I believe this is Jay Schrader's, I think this is on his website somewhere in his system, is it something like, I hope I don't butcher this, but it's like the first thing you have is position. Like that's your fundamentals, being able to understand position. Then once you have that, you have velocity. So it's like position, then velocity, and then movement. That helps your movement, and movement is the key to life, or a key to life. And so it's almost like the same thing. It's like the reflex, velocity is reflexive. Like you can, there's different ways to get velocity. Like you can like think, okay, like static dynamic. All right, like, coming out of a static position, like as fast as I can. But then there's also just the pure reactiveness. Like even when you do like a speed Russian lunge or lunge switch, like there's like a drop like a 1/2 inch drop that primes that. And then the reflexes go and your legs switch and it's just like, boom,
Exactly.
So
yeah,
very
absolutely.
similar.
And I think when you bring it back to like, the soccer player who grew up just playing in his neighborhood, and that sort of person's longevity. I play pickup basketball with one dude. He's Costa Rica's national team's like goals scored record holder. I butchered the way of saying that, but you got the idea. He scored the most goals for the national team and anybody in the country. And, he's still playing solidly like fast basketball at like, I don't know his actual age, but he must be getting like 40, he's in his 40s or something. He's athletic, and like he's not, we don't have like quite as defined strength conditioning, or at least it doesn't match what we have in the US. It doesn't quite equate. There's a little less weightlifting, there's a little less structure to that aspect of training. And people are still, I think one of the biggest things is people just don't really stop playing fully. And I think that's a huge thing is, okay, you have a small injury. Can you do something else? And I think the style of play as well in some other countries, and track is kind of an exception because you always have to do the work. But for, countries where the main sport is soccer, the passing allows everyone to play longer. The ability just like, you get the ball to your feet, you get it out, and that trickles into basketball. You see the international scene playing a very different style of basketball than pounding the air out of the ball. And I think that really begets longevity. Because on a day where you're not really in it, you can still play.
Yeah.
And you don't have to like play one-on-one basketball the entire time. It's like you're still running, you're still jumping, and you didn't have to like take an extended break the same way that a lot more is asked of you in some of our very individualistic ways of playing sports in the States.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of thinking about it. I was just playing Frisbee today before our conversation at ProForce. I had Kevin Hollabaugh on the show last year, and so it was just interesting because today is like kind of my rest day of the week. And it's like Frisbee can be intense. Like if you're running all over the place, but it also can be kind of like a steady, like aerobic level running, but then a lot of passing. And then it's like the perfect, and community. So it's like the perfect recovery day. I actually feel amazing. Like, so but if it was like, I don't know, if it was like 3-on-3 basketball, it could be not the perfect recovery. I mean, it would still be fun. It just depends how you play it, But yeah, I that got me thinking about that a little bit as well. I do think there's and it's like we tend to think of these things so much only in maybe a couple factors, like only intensity. That's the only factor. But like you're saying, like community, I think the community piece is so critical. And even for me, like if I'm playing games with people, my training is so much better. Like, I mean, it's just not even close. And I know that for me to have good, like to be moving well, and plus too, just to test yourself too. Like sometimes you really don't know how well you move until you get out there and start playing, So it's I think that's a huge piece that people miss. And to just community, like to just straight being a straight, like was it centenarian, or I forget what, you live over 100.
Yeah, centenarian. Yeah.
You like the community, I think, is like the biggest thing. Like they say, like the lack of community is like as bad as smoking X amount of cigarettes a day or something like that.
And did you see that Dutch study they did a few years ago where they measured the lifespan of these different types of athletes? Do you see that study?
I don't think I did.
Yeah, so they did the study and they were just measuring in their population how, who lived the longest. They found that, by 2 or 3 years on average, the racket sports players were outliving the endurance athletes.
Interesting.
And usually in the West, we're like, oh, cardiovascular, blah, 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 blah.
Pickleball.
Pickleball. I mean, you're playing tennis, you're moving. And in some ways, that's like almost rougher on certain aspects of your body because you have to move quicker. But you have that community aspect. You have to be playing with someone. It's, there's only so many people, only so much you can do by yourself in those sports. They're mostly a community-based thing. And okay, like that lines exactly up with what you're saying about centenarians is like they're, around people. They're getting active feedback. Their mood is different because they connect to a group as opposed to are just amplifying whatever internal dialogue they have with themselves throughout the day. They go out by themselves. It's just that thing on steroids, like whatever. If it's a negative thought pattern, it just gets worse. Like whereas it's nice to have a disruption to that.
Yeah, I think just with recovery in general, I will say, like, one of my favorite recovery days, this was in my mid-20s, was playing racquetball with my boss, Ron Combs, at Wilmington College. So every Wednesday, we just go play racquetball for like 45 minutes or an hour. It was amazing because it is, you are moving faster than running, but it's also not like max velocity sprinting. Like it's quick, but the force is not necessarily super high. But then you have like that active, it's constant problem solving. Like I think there's something with like that visual spatial problem solving where if this being in a track and field type setting, or just maybe even just typical weightlifting or whatever your fitness medium is, just something that there's like that fun problem solving, like just, I'm sure it lights up, probably to use a trendy word, it lights up your brain or whatever. Like I'm sure there's also a lot of really good things that are probably happening on that level too. It's like engaging more of you. Like you have community, but it also is like visual, spatial, and movement. It was always my favorite recovery day. If I had a racquetball court here, I'd try to play that as well. But I will 100% take frisbee too. That either of those is awesome.
Yeah, for real. I mean, there's a reason why pickleball has become a thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. My neighbors, I've only played like one time. I think my neighbors set it up in their driveway and they had like a big giant tournament. It was amazing. I wanted to go back and play the next day, but I think they took it down.
Still the fun.
Yeah, it's awesome. Definitely, probably it'll be interesting to see too, like, things go in phases, like how long it is so good. You wonder how long, if it'll be a staple for like, a really, really long time, or if there's something else that'll come in and take its place. I don't know. But I wanted to ask you too, before our time's up, a little bit about like things that happen as we age on the level of, you mentioned tissue, like stiffness. You've mentioned that like things get stiffer as we age, but I think on one end, people would say, well, just stretch more, but it's a little bit more than that. I'm just curious how you see that happening, and then things that people can do to keep their tissues. I mean, obviously good therapy is one thing, but other things like practices people can do, physical practices, movement practices that people can do to offset the compression, to keep that stiffness from setting in. I'm sure it's multifactorial, but yeah, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, there's an inside out factor of this kind of like, when we're born, it's almost I think it's a chapter in the Tao Te Ching. It's like when we're born, we're supple. And when we die, we're like stiff and hard. And the same thing we see in nature. A young sapling of a tree is like nice and flexible. And when it's dead, it's easy to crack. And that's exactly what the athlete's life cycle is. And we see this over and over. So what do we see physically, like under my hands, is I see like more muscle tissue attached, like kind of stuck to the tendon, and different like layers of muscles, different layers of fascia that should be sliding in regards to one another are starting to move as one unit. And so instead of like, okay, one person, starts this circle, like starts to pull on something and then somebody else kicks in when it gets hard, it's like everyone's on all the time. And so instead of taking turns, they're just like working at the same time, always exhausted because there's no differentiation. So what are some of the things in addition to that that's also associated with like not getting enough hydration to the muscles and to the fascia itself? And what the heck does that mean? Drink more water, stretch. I mean, you do need to drink water to survive, but that's not really how you're going to get it into your fascia. We do see in Chinese medicine a really big emphasis on herbal supplementation, especially in like Chinese martial arts in terms of like elixir tonics as you get older,
Yeah.
because it's known that you lose some of that elasticity. It's known that like we turn towards this kind of like hot, dried out muscle type if we use our muscles over time, over years, and we age on top of that. And so, there's certain herbs that can actually help to promote circulation, promote nourishing like the fluids in the sinews. And so that's something that I think, maybe at some point, if I was in the States, I'd have products ready made or whatever, because it's easier to ship. But down here in Costa Rica, like I have stuff in California. If somebody wants to be my middleman, I'd love to hire you. So DM me or something. But otherwise, we think about things that we can do on a mechanical level to do that. As we get older, our collagen production is no longer going, if it's supposed to be going north-south to buffer forces, it's getting laid down, especially with inactivity, especially with age, it's getting laid down more haphazard. And so it's not really aligned the way it's not just injuries that do this. We make a big deal out of it, like injury, scar tissue, yada, yada, yada. That process does happen with age as well, is that our collagen is not being put down in quite as an organized fashion as when we were children. And so we need to be doing things, that resemble the thing our goal is for. So if we are an athlete that likes to run and jump, we need to run and jump. There's no question about that. And if we can't, finding ways to do that without as much weight, without as much speed, whatever we need, like that's a huge part of the rehab process that I'm sure people on your podcast are at least somewhat familiar with, if they're not experts already on it. I like isometrics as well, holding tension in lengthened positions, because I find that can really influence the way that collagen is starting to get put down. I like reflexive actions. I like things, small doses for sure of plyometrics, especially high intensity. I like small doses of higher intensity plyometrics, and I like higher doses of low intensity, where we're getting stimulus, where we're actually like remodeling some of the tissue. For me, going for a run even feels like a fascial remodeling. In some ways, when I'm really beat up, it makes my muscles feel much better. That warm-up jog or multi-directional sort of running, cutting, sprinting, like even punching and kicking, doing some kind of like lower level things. I think doing things at different levels of intensity is huge. We can't just be on one speed as we get older. We just don't recover in the same way. And some of the people who are telling you that you can just kind of butcher the recovery process and it doesn't have to apply to you and this and that are doping. like straight up, a lot of the people that are selling this, and they're like incredibly jacked at whatever age, like some of them are real, and then some of them, we all find out later, are up to something punky. And this is a cycle that happens repeatedly because everyone's looking for that holy grail and willing to pay a whole bunch of money for something that looks fishy. But reality is we have to spend more time recovering, and we have to spend more time at levels that allow our tissues to respond, and also understanding that, listening to our body and finding space in the day where we are quiet and reflective enough to feel what our body is trying to tell us is really, really important. And like stillness is a basic human need. It's a basic animal need. Like I watch my dog, I watch my cat, I watch the monkeys in Costa Rica. I watch, the sloths are a great example, but they're also, eating leaves that make them high all the time. So I don't know if they count. But we have a basic need for this. And if we don't get that, we're ignoring what is happening in our system, and we cannot listen to our own bodies, because that is the best check engine light that we can have. The other thing, when we're on the topic of check engine lights, and I think I'll, end my monologue there, is like check engine lights. Okay, tissue quality. So being able to touch your own body, and know by your response, ow, that hurts, and it doesn't usually hurt. Or by like the way the tissue is sliding under your hands, if something is different, because often that's like something's different and then something goes wrong. And those inexplicable injuries, like sometimes it's a huge accident and that's just that. But sometimes you can really, like as a therapist, you can feel it before it happens. You're like, oh man, like I know there's nothing wrong here. I can't tell you don't do something, but I know that something's wrong under my hands. I can't describe it to, a college sports coach, in terms that they'll understand at the biggest, most important meet of their year, and saying like, hey, there's like a 50-50 shot they're going to blow out their hamstring today. Like I can't really, and even if I say that, it's not really, it's almost not ethical because it's so subjective. But at the same time, you can feel that for yourself if you have the time and the tools and the education to do that. Finding measurement. So like you mentioned in our, when we talked before about Merlene Audi, and she attributed some of her longevity, and maybe some of it was the sponsorship, but I don't know, to this tensionomyography thing, where there's like muscle testing. It's supposed to be objective muscle testing of how the muscles are responding, and whether it's objective with a machine or just like a test that you do, like knowing how high you can jump on a certain day is useful in like, hey, I shouldn't be in a dip right now based on my training cycle. Hey, like why, like I slept, I slept enough, I did everything right. Why am I not performing well? And then, okay, I can go home and, listen to my body, or do a couple other tests with a therapist, or, with my coach, and talk to them about what looks off. And that's a major check engine light, is you're not performing, which we sometimes, gets overlooked when we talk about longevity, because we're also thinking longevity, the subtext is that we're performing over the long term. We're not just existing in space and time and like, as our worst version of ourselves, and still just on the court or on the field doing whatever. Like we're the subtext of this conversation is we're performing. And so we have to have a measure for that, and multiple measures that are low enough that we aren't only measuring it for the sake of track and field. We're not only measuring it on meet day. And, that's something I think I made a mistake at as a young coach, was like, I could have caught so many little training errors that I was making, or little errors that somebody was doing technically, if we just had tested more, we just had more in that arsenal of how do I view what's happening right in front of me. So I think, tissue quality, just having the general time in the day, going through like actual testing on a regular basis, whether that's subjective or objective, those are some ways that I think are really, really helpful to paying attention to, like, is my training working? Because you can feel when the tissue is not sliding well. We feel the effects of aging, Yeah.
As you were talking, there was actually three things that I was thinking of. One was with Merlene Audi too. I think Hank Krayenhoff spent a lot of time working with her, and Hank was a huge like tester of all sorts of different things. And you see as well, I've sent emails out about this, but like Pietro Mania, like, was more of a slow twitch sprinter. But then if the fast twitch, the super fast twitch guys tried to handle his training load, they couldn't handle it, and they got overtrained or hurt. And then when they went to the training group that was their fit, they would do better. But I also been thinking about that in the sense of, and this is more on the level of outputs, but to have longevity, you have to find the training that fits you. And that's part of like the journey, is gaining wisdom and understanding the volumes, the types of training that your body does really exceptionally well with. It's almost like thinking about like an extreme example, but like a fish wouldn't have very good longevity if it had to flop around on the land for exercise. Probably it does really well when it gets to go in the water and do what it's really good at. So it's like, I think finding those things that are like a lock for you as an individual are also really helpful. I mean, and of course we're humans, like we're diverse, and we can do a lot of things. It's not just one, but I'm more talking about, I guess we're talking about like lifting, sprinting, jumping, anything with an output, like kind of seeing how your body likes to manage those outputs and finding that thing that really, okay, this is how my body responds ideally to this, is really helpful for setting that long course.
A huge thing as I dive back into training in my 30s has been like, I play, basketball and I jump because, I'm tall and I kind of have the limbs for it. But also we're looking at like, I really respond well to running a little further, to really open up my stride. And if I don't have something like that in the program, even if I'm only doing a short burst sort of sport, I tend to kind of break down, and I tend to kind of get like almost agitated with my performance. I don't know how to describe it, but it just doesn't work. So I'm just backing you up on that one, anecdotally.
Yeah, I agree. Really. I think there's something with high jumpers where it is like, like if we were a little bit faster twitch and maybe the structure was different, maybe we would be sprinters, on some level. I mean, I think you still need fast twitch, but it's almost more about the elasticity, the foot strength, the rhythm, the rotation. Like there's a lot of things that go into that. Like high jumpers are usually bouncy and can maintain bounce for a while. And I know for me, I've become so aware of this The more and more I study about things like the cardiovascular system, having Mark McLaughlin on, Alex Effer actually said this really well, is that where like something like strength training and a strong muscle contraction is compressive, aerobic work is expansive because blood flow expands. And that's like such like a huge, because that just goes hand in hand with cardio as a restorative. But then the trick for me is, how do I get my cardio in? Because if I just go run, I remember one time in my life, I'd taken a break from, it was kind of like, I don't know, maybe like age 23. And I just took a break from hard training. I've been training hard for over 10 years now. I've been obsessed with this for so long. And I just stopped lifting, stopped sprinting, stopped doing everything, and just ran like 30 miles a week, mostly on the roads. And at the end of that, I come back after, I don't know how long I'd done that for, maybe like 2 months. Come back and my vertical had dropped like 8 inches. I could barely touch the rim, like standing vertical. I could barely get the rim, which was 8 inches worse than my peak. Like everything had gone downhill. It was like jumping with bricks in my legs. So just doing that, okay, obviously that's not a good way to get it for me. If I do trail running, that's a little better, diverse, like routes and rocks and different ways to step and things, that's way better. But I find just when I play team sports at like today, like a medium-ish intensity with a lot of skill, if I can get my aerobic system that way and get that expansiveness, that blood flow, I'm just like, oh, my system needs this so badly. And I think I just understand that more and more each passing year. But it also makes me appreciate like BFR training, like the BFR cuffs and things like that. Even if it's just training arms, it's like, get some blood flow going. This is good. This is expansive. So yeah, I'm right there with you. I need to have that in my system for sure. I'll even sometimes do loops around I have a 2/3 of a mile loop around my neighborhood. And like with the curve, it's like, it's kind of like a slanty down curve. So if I do running, I'm always like trying to run off the curve in weird different ways, like backwards, forwards, sideways. My neighbor is probably like, what is this guy doing? I learned that actually from Paul Cater. We went on a run. The one time I went on a run with him, we're going and he's like doing all sorts of, he's like, try not to run the same way for more than like 20 meters. He's always trying to, have your feet experience different things. And that was after going on that run with him. And then we sprinted in the trails in the woods and up and down hills. Later in the day, I was at track practice and just taking off the takeoff board actually felt insane pop off the board because we ran all sorts of different ways and it was expansive and aerobic and in nature. I think we jumped in the ocean that day too. Like it was, so we got everything was on all cylinders there.
That's awesome.
I want to ask you too, as our time's running out, I know we don't have a lot. You mentioned this was stillness, and I just think, I think about Qigong, and I think a lot of people might think of that and just think, oh, like, esoteric and give me a number, or it doesn't fit with the typical training model. But I'm sure you know this very well, and I've just seen, it seems like a lot of people who are in Qigong seem to look younger, they seem to age well. I'm sure there's a lot of factors with that. But I think of this in the sense that I've been programming this recently, and Aaron Cantor, who's been on the show, really got me onto this. You talked about low-level plyometrics, like you see like Tommy John doing calf jumps all the time, like you have that like calf jump intensity, or you have higher intensity, but the Qigong, like just shaking is like that lowest intensity, like just sitting there like kind of shaking. I've actually been programming that for people on rest days, and they absolutely love it. Like, and especially if it's people who are in like more their 30s, but really everybody, but I think you appreciate it more the older you get. And so that being like the lowest level type stimuli. But I was going to ask you more about like things like that, because I know that's your jam. And so things that are like more recovery oriented from Qigong, the Qigong practices like shaking or arm swings or any breathing like that you would program for athletes that you would think athletes would resonate with. Because I think it's one thing to say, all right, hey, I got this Qigong thing, and everyone who's interested, come on, and you get like the hippies, right, or whatever. You got me, I'll show up, for sure. But but then it's another thing to say, hey, I got a group of athletes from diverse backgrounds, and you want to give them something that they tune into, like hey, this you say you could trick them into it, but I'm just curious, just for like a general athlete populations, like practices from the Qigong space that have a restorative quality. I'm curious what your take is on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I've used it just to a variety of extents with different training groups. Obviously, with like one-on-one clients, it's very different than with a team. But I think some of the things that really work well with the team, shaking is definitely one. You talked about low-level plyometric sort of ideas. I think that, yeah, you definitely get that. And then you also get these little bits of mobility in like the spine and the rib cage that you really can't, it's really difficult to get with traditional stretching, just by virtue of shaking your body in a variety of different ways. I'll have a set that I'll go through where we're kind of like shaking side to side. We're shaking, kind of in a spiral sort of motion, catching a spiral on the spine, and then we're waving the spine. And so we're opening up all of these different areas around, the nerve roots, like the central nervous system. It's a physical thing. And so we're opening that area up. So that's sometimes how I explain it. It's like, hey, we're opening up the spine, we're opening up the ribs. This is where your organs are. Your organs are the reason why your body allows you to exercise. If something was wrong with any of these, you would have trouble. You could not do it. And to a lower level, like your body shuts down some level of performance if something's internally off. So the shaking is really one for sure. Swinging, like you mentioned, this is also from some of the Soviet training systems that I've kind of like apprenticed under. We'll do like a lot of the mobility is also like with an element of swinging, and that decompresses areas that almost tractions, the hip out or the shoulder out and gives it space so that you can find yourself in a larger range of motion more comfortably than you could otherwise. So those are two things that I immediately think of. The breathing for me, the first, thing I'll start everybody off on is just like understanding how not to rush the breath, because that's a huge thing within QiGong practice, or at least within Taoist meditation, because I come from an even more esoteric place than QiGong. So in some ways, that's comes with what it comes with. But different stages of meditation, you take on different breathing qualities, and we're using the breath kind of like as a tool to control the mind, but we also need to use the mind as a tool to control the breath. And so the breath to me is a great check-in. Again, if you can find a moment of stillness, you can find some of these visualizations. I don't use a lot of visualizations with athletes who are resistant because it requires them to go inside and they might as well just hum their favorite song. I don't really think that's that useful. So I go for things where you're kind of making larger ranges, finding ranges of motion, doing something where it's almost more like inner work for internal martial arts, where you're really relaxing with a degree of tension on your body, finding these kind of like deep stabilizer muscles, in terms of standing meditation, or like a very simple in and out sort of movement with a specific focus to open up specific areas of the body, torso, or even shoulders, hips, things like that. The other thing about internal martial arts that I love to do is to teach people a little bit just about, and I know you kind of end up coaching this in your own training, but also like 3 harmonies. So the ability of like, especially opposite when we're talking about gait, but the ability of the shoulder and hip to coordinate, the ability of the elbow and knee, and then the foot and the hand. And so finding those things in some of these traditional exercises can be quite useful, because you learn to open and close at the same time. And then if you can't do it while you're in a gait cycle, then, we can look for what's the problem. Is there not enough ankle stiffness? Is there not enough? Is there a restriction in somewhere's mobility? And we can attack that directly. Because sometimes people just need to know, like, it's just patterning both the brain and also the fascial system to work in this way.
As you've heard Sam mention already on the show, herbalism can be a really helpful piece of that athletic longevity equation. And my favorite herbalism company and a sponsor of the show is Lost Empire Herbs. One of my own favorite combinations is the Phoenix formula that Lost Empire Herbs puts out, and they have a lot of other great herbal products in their store that have a wide variety of uses. I've found the Phoenix formula in particular to be one that really works with my athletic needs. If you want to see what Lost Empire Herbs can do for you, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly, and you can use the code Joel15. That's Joel15 for 15% off your order. All right, let's get back to the show.
Yeah.
The leg swings one, actually, that you mentioned, that's something since my time with Aaron Cantor at the workshop he put on. He had us do like 5 minutes of shaking, like QiGong shake, and any like, that's so interesting you mentioned that. I think about the line of reflex too, like with the warm-ups that they were doing in Eastern Europe there. And I think a lot of times we, like, just the value of reflex and opening things up, like, and it could be, a standing shake, anything. Like if something gets shook, it's, I mean, I guess you just think about shaking something loose versus just sitting there and just one constant pull. It's a different type, it just feels more athletic to kind of have that shaking loose quality. And ever since my time with Aaron, and then I was just thinking about a few things. One was like Tim Anderson and rolling, just the value of rolling. And then I've learned about lateral side lying in the Bill Hartman compression expansion type world. I've been putting way more, like, you see them in track all the time, but I think we take it for granted, like lying on your back, leg swings, or lying on your stomach, scorpions, where the legs swing over the back. Like, I remember I used to do this thing, they called it at Wisconsin lacrosse, the Seagrave warm up. I think it must have been based or named after Lawrence Seagrave, but basically you do like a on the ground or a squat or a lunge exercise, then you do like a 40-meter sprint acceleration. And the one movement that I always felt so good in the sprint acceleration after was the lying on my stomach scorpion, like just swinging my legs over the top. So good. And so, but I kind of think I took it for granted. Like now I'll have people doing the lie on their back for like a minute at a time, like lie on your back, let your legs swing. And it's just, I think that's just such an easy initial step for people who might not be used to some of those other things. So, as well as everything else you mentioned, I think it's all really good.
And some of those things, what they'll do too, is they'll teach you to move without adding tension to the system. It's one thing to talk about squat mobility and have somebody take, a full second and a half to like drop down and loosen up and kind of find room in their hips. It's another thing, and this is something that's really been impressed upon me and by some teachers within, the martial arts world, is can you like just fall into a squat?
Yes.
And how many people do you know who actually can do that? How many people do you know that can fall into some of these mobility positions that you're going to find in an athletic environment as well, when we're talking specifically about sport? Because if you don't have mobility there, if you're throwing in a bunch of tension before you even get to the spot, then I'm not so sure that it's that helpful. And I think, because I do really actually, there's a big, I think there's a big like social media pushback against stretching. And I think people certainly like, there's a reason to not like bad stretching, but like there's a reason that a lot of athletes that do their sport for a long time mention stretching in the conversation. Mm-hmm. And there's several reasons, actually. One of them is that freedom of movement. One of them is because stretching does seem to, in my view, like realign the collagen fibers. Yeah. I could find the research. I've seen specific studies that back this, realign collagen fibers along that, specific orientation that the muscle group actually wants to go. So it's a nice low intensity way to do that. And so it's definitely in there, like whether it's under tension or completely free of tension. I think we need to find a balance between those two, where we're okay. Can we hold lengthened positions under tension? That's going to mold our fascial system to one way. And then also, can we let go of all that tension? Because that's ultimately like, the way our body from a Western lens views muscle contraction. It's yin and yang. It's on and off. It's and it may be isometric. It may not be concentric, eccentric, but it's is it stiff? Is it relaxed? Is it stiff? Is it relaxed? And can we make those more differentiated as opposed to being one muddled mess in between? But that's kind of what makes us slow and injured.
Yeah, I love that. I think, if nothing else, I think a good, like even in leg swings, just a good practice for people to do is just the other day, I had an athlete doing leg swings to warm up, and an athlete who has a lot of tension in his running especially. And he was doing leg swings, and there's so much tension even in the leg swing. Like, I think you would think about programming a leg swing, but I don't think we watch for like, well, can you actually relax? So I had him like not even doing swings. I said, just do circles with your leg at the bottom, like let all the tension out. And it took him a long time, but when he finally got it, it was so much cleaner and easier. And I think for all the time we spend teaching athletes how to compress, how to turn on, which I think obviously lots of value in learning to achieve muscle tension for the sake of athleticism, power outputs, but at least spend a little time learning to turn everything off completely and to have an eye for, hey, how well can you relax? I mean, even like easy strength, Dan John Pavel, fast and loose. I have this image in my mind of this guy who's like just flapping his arms around and all the tension is out. And I just don't think we talk about that enough. I mean, even if you just took 2 minutes out of an hour's time to do that, I think it would be really worth a lot of people's time for that.
Yeah, for real. I think, and I think you touched on a good point of like, we're not telling anybody to not do exercise that, promotes muscle tension. Like even I hear people even like in the internal martial art world or in the QiGong world, that's like, oh, you need to like be completely relaxed. Like, no, you don't need to be a loose noodle. Like that's not the goal. If you actually meet the people who use it as a martial art, that's not how you do it. It's finding ways to refine the movement, and like then trim off the fat. And then, okay, like what is the least amount of effort that I need to do this common movement? And then that's when you start to add velocity to something. That's when you start to add efficiency to something. And that's what the natural training process in great athletes leads us towards in general. But it's figuring out, like we've talked about, reverse engineering it for those of us who don't naturally fall into that, or we have a hiccup in our training process, an injury, stress, all these different things. Then it's figuring out, like, for example, and I realize we have limited amount of time, but one thing that I think people don't really fully realize, and we talked about QiGong, is like how our internal organs affect our movement. And my wife works a lot with neurovisceral manipulation. So she's very much a, Western style, in addition to acupuncture, she does Western style massage, but like at a very organ-based level. And like if someone has an organ that's stuck, and I've had work from her and felt the difference after, like you can't twist if your liver is engorged with blood. And like if we're stressed in our life, we have this, in Chinese medicine, we label that liver qi stagnation. It's not a pathology. You're not going to get sick from it, but you're going to be constantly frustrated. You might have digestive issues when you get stressed. You might have, it's really based on stress, liver qi stagnation, stress, frustration, that feeling of somebody cuts you off, in traffic, and you're like that's like stagnant. I can't move and I want to move. That's stagnation, and that will physically leave a solidity and a stiffness and a inability to move at the level of the liver. And the liver's job is to get the blood, to return to the liver and recharge it, and then to get it out to the muscles, to get it out everywhere it needs it. So if that doesn't do its job, A, we don't recover as well. B, we can't rotate, because it's at the level where of like about T9, where the rotations of our shoulders and hips meet when we go to walk and run. So like if that area is stuck, then that person won't be able to rotate, and there's really not much we could do musculoskeletally if that's the case. And that's what you see more and more when people get older, is that young people don't really have stiffnesses deeply ingrained like that. Whereas and this is towards the I hope people watch toward the end to hear that, but like if you get nothing else, like that internal body, that ability to buffer stress, to live a healthy, clean lifestyle, like that shows up in our organs, and that showing up on our organs is how we mediates with our movement specifically. Yeah. And there are things with Chinese medicine we can do to alleviate that, but like and qigong as well, like just massaging that area, like even just pounding on that area, in a variety of ways to send a vibration inside. But best to also live a lifestyle that allows us to feel good.
Yes, yeah. Yelling in traffic every day, probably not good for longevity, just on any level, athletic or otherwise. But yeah, I know, like we could to talk about the ramifications. I had acupressure point questions for you. I'm sure there'd be like another hour. Like, we'll have to save it for another day. I will just leave with the last thing. As you were talking, even just like the percussion, like even like kind of like even, gentle, like kind of percussion on your body, that do it with your own fists. Like we did that as part of Aaron Cantor's warm up too, is like shaking, percussion, arm swinging. Like I felt so good after that. And it's so interesting between Aaron, who I think is in his early 40s. I think he's like 42. Rafe Kelly, they're both part of like Rafe Kelly owns Evolve Move Play. Aaron helps work as one of their coaches for Evolve Move Play. Rafe Kelly's 41 or 42, just hit some crazy cork trick that he, for the first time in his life at 41. But that brought me to the other end, way back to what you said, like just like learning new things, just like skills and feeling alive and the joy in learning something new. To me, I think there's so many ways that you can keep it that way. But I've had a really good experience through Evolve Move Play as well, just like those things to stay young, because a lot of those people, I was really amazed by how athletic. So that like the older, gosh, like is middle age something I could start calling? I guess I have to start calling myself that. But like the level of athleticism that was retained and the joy that came with it was really something that was special. So as you've been talking, I've seen those themes show up in my own experiences there. But yeah, I know you have to get going. I know we talked about isometrics, and last time I had a question about the isos, the intensity. Well, maybe I'll ask you this: like 5-minute grinding iso lunge hold or 20-minute horse stance. Role of that in longevity, lightning round, one, quick answer. Any thoughts on that kind of thing for
That's the accelerate to 60 meters, and then after a certain age, like that's probably not where you want to spend most of your time is grinding that out. But keeping small doses of it can definitely, and making it fun, making it dynamic, putting a ball between your legs when you're in one of those lunges, like playing a sport while you're there, like those are ways to kind of maintain tissue quality. So you don't need to be that long, but definitely having some level of getting into that zone where you're really remodeling the tissue is important too.
Yeah, I found for me at age 40, I can do twice a week. I can do 2 long hold days or 1.5. If it becomes about 3 or 4, that could be hard to sustain over time. But 2 seems to be the sweet spot for me.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with some other people I talk to. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sam. It was great talking to you again. And yeah, I know you have some new things going on. Is there a place that people can find what you're up to and some of your work?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Wayofsam.com or Instagram, way_of_Sam, SAM, not too complicated to spell. You can find kind of what's going on with me. I have people come down here and train in Costa Rica. I have some online education programs. I think we could do a whole podcast, honestly, on the meridian acupressure side of things, because that's a whole nother conversation where we can actually get into specifics. And that's part of what I want to do, is really integrate these two worlds, because I find them so useful in my own life in working with athletes, even whether it's from the perspective of having the lens to view kind of a holistic person and holistic movement, to the nuts and bolts of like, hey, this is a quick fix. We don't have to deal with this injury for 4 weeks. We can do it in 1. So figuring out things like that. So if you're interested, just send me a message. I usually respond pretty quick. So but yeah, thanks for having me on, Joel. This is a great conversation. Love to continue it sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to I'm sure I'll have a lot of questions for you here in the coming weeks and months. So, well, thank you and maybe someday I can get down to Costa Rica and get in on those pickup babasketball games. So I'm sure I'll also be quite tall.
Yeah. We've got some older guys down here, that can really play. I really think being outside of whatever your local environment is, it really gives you some perspective, whether you evolve, move, play, or whatever it is. It's nice to see, examples of people who are doing it for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you again, Sam. I'll talk to you later. Thanks for tuning into the episode. I appreciate you all being here. I'll see you next week.